Right now at Zion, we are in a series actually on a book of the Bible. All summer long, we are studying the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. And just in case you're new here, you're a guest here, maybe you've come back for the first time in a long time, let me kind of give you a lay of the land as to what this series is all about, just to kind of catch you up. One of the fascinating features of the book of Genesis is that it is full of some pretty famous stories. For instance, in a few weeks, if you like special effects, come on back, because we're going to be talking about a story that involves a couple of cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, and God does some special effects on them because they struggle in the holiness department. He rains down fire and brimstone on them. You may have heard that story before. Or you get to the end of the book of Genesis, and you read about a guy named Joseph. Joseph has 11 brothers, and he is the favorite of his father's 12 sons. And as a token of his affection that his father has for Joseph, he gives to Joseph a coat of many colors. Maybe you've heard that story before too. In fact, you don't have to be a Bible scholar or know a lot about the Bible to know these stories, because these are stories that just culturally we tell. But one of the things that we're discovering and uncovering in this series is that at the heart of the book of Genesis is not just a collection of stories that we tell. At the heart of the book of Genesis is meant to be a collection of stories that tell us. Genesis is meant to tell us things about life and tell us things about hope, tell us things about faith, tell us things about God. At the heart of this book of stories that we tell is a book of stories that is meant to tell us about the things in life that matter the most. And so kind of the big overarching question of this series is this: what can these stories that we tell us? Now, today we actually come to another pretty famous story in the book of Genesis. This one out of Genesis chapter 11. It is the story of history's first very big building. Now, before we dive in, let me give you the backstory to this story. If you back up a few chapters to Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9, you will read the story of a guy named Noah. We talked about him last weekend in church. And Noah managed to survive a flood by riding it out in an ark with he and his family and a bunch of animals. It was like the worst natural disaster in the history of the world. Now, here's the deal. If you've ever been in or seen a natural disaster on TV, then you know that natural disasters can do a lot of damage in just a little bit of time. So my favorite place to go every summer along with my family is Port Aransas. I've mentioned this before. I love the sand and the surf and the Texas Gulf Coast. And a few years ago, back in 2017, there was a Category 4 hurricane that struck Port Aransas. And Port Aransas, in a very short period of time, sustained a lot of damage. It went from looking like this to looking like, well, this after Hurricane Harvey, because that's what natural disasters do. Now, blow this natural disaster up about 10,000-fold, and you will get a picture of what happened to the world when Noah rode out the flood in an ark. Not only was one city a little destroyed, every city was destroyed. Not only was one building a little dilapidated, every building was swept away in a torrent. Now, the great thing about Port Aransas is that just a few years out from Hurricane Harvey, this Category 4 hurricane, Port Aransas has managed to rebuild, and actually rebuild bigger and better than ever. And that's exactly what people are beginning to do in Genesis 11 after the big flood. They not only want to rebuild, they want to rebuild bigger and better than ever. And here's how they do it. Genesis 11, beginning at verse 1. Now, the whole world had one language and a common speech. And I want to pause right there, just give you a little bit more context here. One of the things about this flood is that it was so devastating that it not only wiped out buildings and cities, it wiped out basically all of civilization. And so by the time you get to Genesis 11, there's only one people, one culture, with one language. This is a uniculture. There's only one little group of people who's basically rebuilding civilization from the ground up. And as they begin to do this, Genesis 11 verse 2, they move eastward and they found a plain in a region called Shinar. Just to kind of situate you here, that would be modern day Iraq, and they settled there. And they said to each other, all right, it's time to get rebuilding. Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. Now, just a little bit more context here for you. The fact that these people are able to make bricks represents a major technological advance in human history. Because up to this point in history, people, when they built, they would build with stones. And stones are good because they're sturdy. They're also hard to build with because they're different shapes and sizes. And so they go from stones to bricks, which are easier to build with because they're all the same shape and they're all the same size. You can build bigger and faster and better than ever. And so they use brick, verse 3 says, instead of stone, and they stick it all together by using tar for mortar. And so they have all their bricks ready to go. They pull out their blueprints, and here's what they're going to build. They're going to build themselves a city with a tower that has its top reaching all the way up to the heavens. Now, it's at this point in the ancient world that if you were listening to the story or reading the story for the very first time, you would begin to become a little bit puzzled. And here's why. These people are building themselves a city. Now, in our day and in our age, here's the way we define city. A city is a large town. Wahlberg, town, Austin, city. But back then, cities were not defined by population density. They were actually defined by a particular physical feature. A city was any group of people that built a wall around them. And the reason you'd always have walled cities in the ancient world is because you wanted to protect yourself from invaders. For example, real famous city in the Bible, Jericho. Anybody ever heard of this city? There was a commander of the Israelite army. His name was Joshua. He led the Israelite army to fight a battle against the city of Jericho. And the reason that Joshua was able to win, you may remember this from Sunday school, is because the walls came what? Tumbling down. That's the reason you build walls, to protect yourselves from people like Joshua, foreign armies, foreign invaders. And so here's this group of people, and they're building a city. They're building a wall around themselves. And then at the center of their city, they build this tower. And it's a tower that is tall. It has its top that reaches all the way up to the heavens. Now, this was not like an office building, okay? It did not have some sort of executive suite in it. It wasn't a bunch of commerce people working in business. This was more like a watchtower. You could climb up the side of the tower, and you could look out and see for miles over the plain of Shinar. That way, you could see invaders coming before they even got to your city. And that is what makes this story so incredibly puzzling. Because think about it. How many people groups are there? One. How many cultures are there? One. How many languages do they speak? One. In fact, back to Genesis 11, verse 1, it says, now the what? The whole world decides that they're going to move east and they're going to build this city with a wall and a tower to protect themselves from who? Because it's the whole world that's doing it. It turns out that these people aren't building this city to protect themselves. They're building this city for something else. And they actually tell us why they're building this city as they're building the city. Back to Genesis 11, verse 4. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that has its top that reaches way up in the heavens, and here's why we want to do it. So that we can make a name for ourselves. It turns out that these people do not want to protect themselves. They want to promote themselves. They want all the generations who come after them to remember them, acknowledge them, and celebrate them for the city and the tower that they were able to build. They want all the people who come after them to look at them and go, I cannot believe that right after a giant flood, this is what you were able to do. Wow and ooh. That's what they want people to say about them. They aspire to greatness. Which is why what happens next in this story is almost comical. Because all of a sudden, in the middle and in the midst of this story, God shows up. Genesis 11, verse 5, the Lord shows up, and what does he do? He comes down to see the city and the tower that the people were building. Now, the fact that the Lord has to come down to see this city and this tower is a little more than ironic. And here's why. If you back up to Genesis 11, verse 4 again, what kind of tower are they building? They're building a tall tower with a top that reaches all the way up to the heavens, all the way up to where they believe that God was. In fact, a little bit more historical context here for you. Most scholars think the kind of tower that these people were building was a tower that was known as a ziggurat. Now, you can still find ziggurats all over the ancient world. In fact, you can still find them in modern-day Iraq. There's actually a ziggurat called the Ziggurat of Ur. I brought a picture of the Ziggurat of Ur so you can take a look at it. And here's what these towers were. They were basically towers that doubled as temples. And what you would do is you would climb up the steps of the ziggurat. You can see the stairway right there. And you would get all the way up to the heavens. And that's where you would meet with and sacrifice to and pray with and worship the gods and goddesses of whatever culture you were living in. In other words, they wanted to build a tower, a ziggurat, so that they could go up and they could ascend to God. And not only would they be able to promote themselves to other people and to generations who come after them, they would be able to promote themselves to God. They would be able to impress God with what they've been able to do, so that even God would look at it and go, I cannot believe that after a giant flood, this is what you were able to do. Wow and ooh. Now, here's the problem. Here's the problem. When the people are building this city and this tower, to them it looks massive. To God, it looks a little more miniature. To them, it looks powerful. To God, it looks a little more puny. He has to come down just to see it. In fact, the best way I know how to describe it is kind of like this. So one of the things that my kids love to play with in our house are Legos. And they actually build some pretty impressive things. They build homes and they build vehicles. They actually build like little villages, all sorts of things with the Legos. Now, Legos are fun for kids. They're dangerous for dads. Here's why. Have you ever been walking through the house and stepped on one of those things barefoot? Like, that'll send you to the ER if you're not careful. What happened? I got impaled by a Lego, right? It's dangerous. Here are these people on the plain of Shinar, and they're going, hey, look at us. We're building with bricks. To which God says, this kind of looks like you're building with Legos. And it may be fun for you, but it's also dangerous to you. And here's why. God says in Genesis 11, verse 6, if as one people speak in the same language, they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. In other words, if they're able to build a tower this tall and a city this big this time, what are they going to be able to do next time? And the bigger the city and the taller the tower, the more massive their ego is going to become. And that's not good. That's dangerous. And so God decides that he's going to put a stop to it. Genesis 11, verse 7, he says, come, let's go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other. It's really hard to cooperate with each other in a giant building project if you can't even speak to each other. And so the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. He was left in the dust, right there on the plain of Shinar. Unfinished, undone. And then this note in verse 9, that is why the city was called Babel. Because by the time God got through with them, the only thing they could do was babble to each other because they couldn't understand each other. Here's the thing. What they built was impressive. It was great. But then it all fell apart, and here's why. Because what they built was built with an arrogant and selfish heart. And here's where the story gets real relevant and real practical and real personal for each and every one of us, because I know this. It doesn't matter if you've ever walked onto a construction site. It doesn't matter if you've ever worn a hard hat, ever put one brick on top of another. Each and every one of us in this room today are in the building business. Because the reality is, every single one of us is building something. What are you building? Maybe you're building your career. You come in early and you stay late and you work hard and you jump from job to job so that you can climb that corporate ladder and just keep getting better. Maybe for you, you're building your body. You hit the gym for 2 hours a day. You count your calories and you cut your carbs and you take your supplements and you want to be stronger than ever, healthier than everybody. Maybe for you, you're building your investment account. You're living on less so you can squirrel away more so that a little bit later in life, you won't just be living in the golden years of life, you'll be living in the diamond years of life. Doesn't matter who you are, we're all building something. And the question that this story invites us to ask is this: could it be that sometimes you and me build great things for selfish and arrogant reasons? Could that be true of me and you? That career that you're building, why do you build it? Could it be so that you can reach the top of the corporate ladder? And your LinkedIn account can be better than anybody else's? So that everybody who looks at you will go, wow, and ooh. That body that you build, especially for young guys, we all know this, right? You always want to be brawnier than your buddies. Could it be that the reason you're doing that is so that all your buddies will look at you and go, wow, and ooh? Or maybe that investment account that you're squirreling money away in. Could it be that that's just for you so that you'll be able to do whatever it is you want to? And all those pictures that you post of all the good things you're doing will make everybody else go, wow, and ooh. Why do you build what you build? Here's the problem with building great things for arrogant and selfish reasons. Just like Babel, if you build that way, you'll never actually finish. You never will. I don't care how far up the corporate ladder you climb, there's always going to be somebody just a little higher than you. I don't care how much strength you build, there's always going to be somebody just a little stronger than you. I don't care how much money you save, there's always going to be somebody just a little richer than you. And so the real question that we need to ask ourselves is this: how do we build something that is blessed instead of something that is just Babel? How do we build a great thing for a great reason? I mean, what should we be building anyway? So, in the first century, there lived this man. His name was Paul. You may have heard of him before because he wrote quite a few books that we have in our Bible and our New Testament. And Paul was an ancient missionary. He traveled all over the ancient world preaching the gospel of Jesus. And one of the places that he traveled to was a town on the northern coast of Greece called Thessalonica. Now, Thessalonica in the ancient world was a big deal. In fact, it was a huge city, had 200,000 people there, and in the first century, that would have been like, going to New York City in our day. It was the Roman capital of a Roman province, Macedonia, and one of the things that Thessalonica was known for was its big and bold and beautiful buildings. These people knew how to build great things in Thessalonica. In fact, I want to show you a picture. This is a picture of something called the Roman Forum. You can still go and visit the ruins of the Roman Forum even today. Now, the Roman Forum was a one-stop shop for everything. They had it all. You could go there and you could go to a mall and go shopping. You could go there and you could go to not one but two Roman baths. They had a couple of swimming pools there. You could go there. They actually had a courthouse in the Roman Forum. You got legal troubles? Just go to the Roman Forum. You could even go there and they had a miniature amphitheater where you could watch the gladiator games. It was big, it was bold, it was beautiful. It was a paragon of what good architecture looked like. Now, there's this little group of Christians who are living in Thessalonica, and quite frankly, they're struggling because they're being persecuted and they don't feel like they can build much, especially in a town like Thessalonica. And so Paul writes a letter to this group of Christians in Thessalonica. We have it in our Bibles as 1 Thessalonians. And in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, Paul tells these Christians the best thing that they can ever build. Even if you can't build anything else, Paul says, don't worry about building a tall tower like at Babel. Don't worry about building a huge Roman Forum like in Thessalonica. Here's what I want you to build. Here's the kind of people I want you to be. I want you to be people who build each other up. Because when you build people, you build something that actually lasts. I want you, Paul says, to take what you've built and use it to build others up. That career that you've built. Rather than looking up the rungs on the corporate ladder going, how do I get to that next one? Maybe you look down the rungs on the corporate ladder and you find someone who's a little bit further down the corporate ladder than you, and you say to them, let me help you. And you build them up. Or that strength and conditioning that you're trying to do. Rather than just trying to get stronger all for yourself, maybe you find someone who's a little bit down the health path behind you, and you try to help them so that they too can build their bodies up. That investment account that you have, maybe you don't just ask the question, what can I spend? You ask the question, what can I leave? So that future generations can be built up. In fact, can I let you in on a little secret? This is how God builds. The thing that God wants to build more than anything else is you. In fact, if you fast forward through the book of Genesis, and you go 16 chapters later to Genesis chapter 27, you meet a guy, his name is Jacob. We'll talk more about him in a few weeks here at Zion. And Jacob has an older brother by a few minutes. His older brother's name is Esau. Now, there's this story that surrounds Jacob and Esau that has to do with basically an inheritance. Okay, who's going to inherit the estate? Because in that culture, in that day, and in that age, it was standard practice that the oldest son of any family would become the executor and the inheritor of the family estate. Now, Jacob didn't really like that much because, he was only a couple minutes younger than his older brother. And so Jacob comes up with a plan. He goes in to his father, he dresses up like his brother, and he essentially tricks and cons his father into signing over the executorship of the whole estate to him. Now, when his older brother, by a couple of minutes, Esau, finds out about this, do you think he's very happy about this? Yes or no? No, he's not, because he's just lost a lot of money. And so he actually threatens to kill his little brother Jacob. And Jacob has to run away, take it on the lam, and he winds up one chapter later in Genesis 28 in the middle of nowhere. He's all alone. He's scared. And he's exhausted. So exhausted, in fact, that he lies down in the middle of nowhere and he actually uses a pillow for a rock, or uses a rock for a pillow, and he still manages to fall asleep. And when he falls asleep, he has this dream in Genesis 28, verse 12. It's a dream in which he sees, now look at this language, a stairway. In fact, a lot of scholars think the stairway that he saw was actually a stairway on a tower, or like a ziggurat. And it was resting on the earth. But then look at this language. It had its top reaching all the way up to the what? To the heavens. This is straight out of Genesis 11, verse 4. Because in Genesis 11, verse 4, what do? They build a ziggurat, a tower, a stairway that has its top that's reaching all the way up to the heavens. But I'll tell you what, the ziggurat that Jacob sees is a lot different than the ziggurat that the people in Genesis 11 are building. Because on this ziggurat, Genesis 28, verse 12, he sees these angels of God. They're ascending and descending on it. And not only does Jacob see the angels of God, he actually sees God himself. Now, here's where God is. Verse 13, he's at the bottom of the ziggurat. He's come all the way down the stairway, and he's standing right beside him. And he says to Jacob, I'm with you, and I'll watch over you wherever you go. Here's the problem that Jacob has. Jacob tried to build his life by conning his father and stealing from his brother. And now his con is all fallen apart. What Jacob has tried so hard to build has all come crashing down. But here's how God responds to Jacob's failed building project. God says, all right, it's all fallen down. Well, here's what I'll do. I'll come down to you. And that's the difference between what the people build in Genesis 11 and what God builds in Genesis 28. Because when the people build a ziggurat in Genesis 11, here's what they're doing. They're trying to ascend up to God, to prove themselves to God. But when God builds a stairway and a ziggurat and a tower in Genesis 28, he doesn't build it so that Jacob can climb it to him. He builds it so that he can come all the way down to him. And so that he can deliver a message to Jacob. Even if everything you've built has fallen apart, I'll still be with you. Because I love you with all my heart. Here's how God builds. He builds down so that he can build us up. It's kind of like this. So I went to a Lutheran parochial school, kind of like the one that we have here, pre-K through 8th grade. And one of the things that I loved the most about my Lutheran parochial school was that Fridays, there were lots of things I've learned, I'm sure, but I forgot most of that. Fridays were donut days. That's what I remember about my Lutheran education, okay? And for 35 cents, here's what you could do. You could buy a donut, and not just the plain donuts. You could get a premium donut like an apple fritter. Those are good. Now, donut days were kind of mixed bags for me, okay? Sometimes donut days were days of delights. Other times, donut days were days of despair, and here's the reason why. I needed 35 cents to buy the donut, and I'd go to my parents every Friday morning, and I'd ask for 35 cents. Sometimes they said yes, but sometimes, can you believe this? To someone as sweet as me, they would say no. And there's this one Friday, it was a donut day. I asked my parents for 35 cents, and you know what they say to me? They say, They say no. And I let them know that I was not happy with their answer. I immediately may have thrown a bit of a temper tantrum, gotten a little upset. I gave them the hangdog look. And I continued my protest as they took me to school, and even once I got to school, I had the hangdog look. I was shuffling along the hallway, and my face was down, and my expression was forlorn. I was in a tortured state because I couldn't get a donut. And as I'm kind of throwing myself a little pity party walking through my school hallways, there's this voice that sneaks up behind me and says, "Zachary." And I spin around to see who's talking to me, and right there in front of me is someone who I can only describe as a giant, otherwise known as an 8th grader, because I was like in 1st or 2nd grade when this happened. And when you're that young and that little, right, 8th graders, they look like giants. And so I crane my neck upwards to kind of look at this giant of an 8th grader. And he says to me again, "Zachary, what's up? You look down." And I'm thinking, well, finally, someone's going to listen to my donut dilemma. And so I tell him my saga and my sob story. You know what he does? He reaches into his pocket, and he pulls out 35 cents. The only 35 cents that he had, by the way, was 35 cents that his parents had given to him. And then here's what he does. He kind of leans down. He comes right down to my level, and he takes what he had pulled out of his pocket, and he puts it into my hand. And he says to me, "I think you need this more than I do today." It was the best donut day ever. Listen, I don't know what you're building, and I don't know how it's going. I know you're building something. And you know what? Maybe it's going great and you're flying high and feeling good. Then again, maybe a crisis has struck, a tragedy has happened, and it's fallen apart, and you've walked in here today with a broken heart. Because it's all come crashing down. I don't know what you're building or how it's going, but here's what I do know. No matter how well or how poorly it's going, we have a God who's reaching into his pocket and pulling out everything he has. All of his grace and all of his mercy, all of his love, all of his kindness, all of his faithfulness, all of his compassion, all of his forgiveness, and all of his salvation. And what he does is he kind of comes down to our level. He descends the stairway of that ziggurat from heaven all the way to earth. And no matter how low he has to go, even if it means that his son winds up on a cross, he takes everything that he has in those pierced and nailed hands and he gives it to us for our lives. Because, my brothers and sisters, that's how God builds. And you are who God builds. The simple message of God's love and God's faithfulness is this. God came all the way down in Jesus so that you could be built up. And let me tell you something. That's not just babble. That's the truth.